Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of emotional triggers.
Oh, emotional triggers.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from the book Positive and Negative Mental Triggers. Learn how to master them.
I love that title.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Very descriptive.
So we're going to be exploring what emotional triggers are, why they matter, and how to recognize them, and then how to start to manage them effectively.
Yeah, and this is something that I think everyone listening can relate to.
Absolutely.
Because we all have them.
We all have them.
And, sometimes they really can kind of throw you for a loop.
Yeah, for sure.
When you have that really intense emotional reaction to something and you're like, wait a minute, where did that come from?
Right, like why am I so upset about this spilled milk?
Exactly.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly is an emotional trigger?
Well, you can think of it like this. It's anything that evokes a strong emotional response in you.
Okay.
So it could be a sound, a smell, a certain phrase, a situation, and it transports you back to a past experience, and you suddenly feel all those same emotions flooding back.
So it's like my brain is hitting the fast forward button on my emotional response.
Exactly. And it can be really jarring because it can feel like it's out of proportion to what's actually happening in the present moment.
So it's not just like, oh, I'm a little annoyed. It's like, whoa, this is bringing up a lot of other stuff.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand these triggers, because it can help us to understand our reactions and to manage them more effectively.
Okay, so you mentioned it can be any kind of thing, any kind of sensory input.
Yeah.
What are some examples of things that can be emotional triggers?
Well, let's say you hear a song that reminds you of a really painful breakup.
Okay, yeah, heartbreak.
Yeah. Or maybe you're at work and a colleague makes a comment that makes you feel inadequate.
Ooh, yeah, I felt that.
Even if it's not intended that way.
Right, even if it's something small.
Exactly. But it triggers that feeling of inadequacy maybe from past experiences.
So it's not just about the present moment. It's like all of this baggage from the past is coming up.
Exactly. And that's what can make those reactions feel so intense and overwhelming.
Okay, so we tend to think of triggers as being negative things that cause anxiety or sadness or anger.
Right.
But can they also be positive?
They absolutely can.
Okay.
I mean, think about that feeling you get when you smell freshly baked cookies.
Oh, yeah?
It brings back those warm, fuzzy memories of childhood, and you just feel this sense of comfort and happiness.
So that's a positive trigger.
Exactly. It's tapping into those positive memories and emotions.
Interesting.
And it's important to remember that triggers aren't inherently good or bad. It's really about how they affect us and how we respond to them.
Okay, so triggers can be both positive and negative, but how do we even begin to figure out which ones are impacting us?
Right, because it can feel a little intangible.
Yeah.
It's all about paying attention.
Okay.
Noticing those moments when your emotional reaction feels bigger than the situation warrants. The book suggests keeping a journal, an emotion journal, almost like a detective's notepad.
I like that.
Right.
So I'm taking notes.
You're taking notes right down when you feel that surge of emotion and what triggered it.
So if I'm noticing that I get really anxious every time I have to speak up in a meeting,
Right.
that could be a trigger.
Exactly. It could be a sign that there's something deeper going on, maybe a fear of public speaking or a fear of being judged.
Yeah.
And once you start tracking these triggers, you might start to see patterns emerge.
So maybe it's not just meetings. Maybe it's anytime I have to speak up in a group setting.
Right. Or maybe it's a certain phrase that people use that consistently sets you off.
That makes sense. So it's about noticing those patterns.
Exactly. And sometimes those triggers are linked to past experiences, especially ones that were traumatic.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit earlier.
Right. So imagine someone who's been in a car accident.
Okay.
Even years later, they might feel a surge of anxiety every time they get into a vehicle.
Even if they consciously know that they're safe?
Exactly, because that trauma has created a deep association between cars and fear.
The book mentions a similar example with medical trauma.
Yes.
So someone who had a difficult experience in a hospital,
Right.
they might have a strong reaction to the smell of disinfectant,
Exactly.
even if they're just walking past the cleaning aisle at the grocery store.
Because that smell triggers those memories and those associated feelings of fear or discomfort.
It's amazing how our brains work.
It really is, and it makes sense when you understand how our brains process trauma.
Okay, how so?
After a traumatic experience, our brains try to make sense of what happened, and to protect us in the future.
Okay.
And sometimes that means creating these simplified explanations, these emotional reasoning patterns.
Like what?
Like, the world is a dangerous place, or I'm not good enough.
So it's like my brain is trying to protect me.
Exactly, but sometimes those protective mechanisms end up backfiring.
Because they're based on a past experience that might not even be relevant anymore.
Right, and that's why it's so important to become aware of these patterns and to challenge those negative beliefs that might not be serving us anymore.
Okay, so we've talked about how these triggers can stem from past experiences,
Right.
even trauma. But I'm curious, why should we care about all of this?
That's a great question.
Like, how does understanding our triggers actually help us in our day-to-day lives?
Well, it's all about empowering yourself.
Okay.
Because when you understand your triggers, you gain a sense of control over your emotional responses instead of feeling like your emotions are controlling you.
Oh, I like that.
Right, because imagine being able to navigate those challenging situations without feeling hijacked by your feelings.
Right, instead of just like reacting.
Exactly, you're able to pause and to choose a more conscious response.
That would be amazing.
It would be life-changing.
But how do we actually do that?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do we manage these triggers once we've identified them?
Well, it's not about erasing the past or trying to pretend these triggers don't exist. It's about developing strategies to cope with them effectively.
So what are some of those strategies?
Well, the book outlines a few key approaches.
Oh,
One option is to reduce your exposure to those triggers.
so if I know that a certain song always makes me cry,
Right.
I just avoid listening to it?
Exactly, but that's not always feasible.
Right. I can't exactly avoid all elevators if I'm afraid of elevators.
Exactly. So that's where other strategies come in.
Okay, like that.
Well, the book also talks about the power of creating positive triggers.
Ooh, I like that.
It's like rewiring your brain's emotional circuitry.
So intentionally associating positive feelings with certain routines or phrases,
Exactly.
like that example you gave earlier of saying I'm home,
Yes.
as a trigger to let go of work stress.
Exactly. It's about consciously creating those positive associations so that you can start to shift your emotional default setting over time.
Okay, so give me some more examples of positive triggers that I can start incorporating into my life.
Absolutely. Well, maybe it's listening to an uplifting playlist when you start to feel your energy dip.
Okay, I like that.
Or maybe it's lighting a scented candle that evokes a sense of tranquility.
Ooh, yeah.
Or even just spending a few minutes each day practicing gratitude.
It's about those little tweaks that can make a big difference.
Exactly. And of course, if you're struggling with particularly intense or persistent triggers, seeking professional help from a therapist can be incredibly valuable.
Right, because they can provide you with personalized coping skills and strategies.
Exactly. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness, which have been shown to be really effective in managing triggers.
So we've talked about the personal impact of triggers.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, are there other areas where this understanding can be applied?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the fascinating world of how emotional triggers are used intentionally in marketing to influence our purchasing decisions.
Wait, really?
Oh, absolutely. Think about those limited time offers that create a sense of urgency, or those celebrity endorsements that leverage authority.
Right, like if Oprah recommends it, it must be good.
Exactly. Those are all examples of emotional triggers being used to sway our behavior.
I never thought about it like that. It feels like my brain is being hacked by marketing gurus.
Well, in a way it is, but the more aware we become of these tactics, the less susceptible we are to their influence.
So it's all about becoming more aware of the forces that are shaping our emotions and our choices.
Exactly, both in our personal lives and in the wider world.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into emotional triggers.
We have.
We talked about what they are, why they matter,
Right.
and how they can stem from both positive and negative experiences,
And even trauma.
and even trauma. And we even touched on how these triggers are intentionally used in marketing.
Yes.
But I feel like there's still so much more to explore.
There is, and in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to take a closer look at different types of triggers, including sensory triggers, emotional triggers, and situational triggers. We'll also delve deeper into the impact of trauma and explore more strategies for building resilience.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to continue this exploration with you. But before we move on, is there anything you want our listeners to ponder as they go about their day?
Yeah, I would say pay attention to your own emotional landscape.
Hey.
Notice those moments when you have a strong emotional reaction that seems out of proportion to the situation.
Okay.
And ask yourself, could this be a trigger?
And if so, where might it be coming from?
Exactly. The more aware you become, the more empowered you'll be to manage your emotional well-being.
That's great advice. And for those who want to delve deeper into this topic, we highly recommend checking out the source material for this episode, Positive and Negative Mental Triggers. Learn how to master them. It's packed with insights and practical strategies. We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll continue to unravel the fascinating world of emotional triggers. Until then, stay curious. Welcome back to the deep dive. In part 1, we kind of laid the groundwork for understanding emotional triggers.
Those tricky little things.
Yeah, those sneaky time travelers that can really, transport us back to those intense past experiences.
Yeah.
Now we're going to explore the different ways those triggers actually show up in our lives.
Yeah, we've got a whole toolkit of triggers to unpack.
A toolkit.
Yeah, think of it like that.
Look,
from sensory triggers to situational triggers, emotional triggers, we're going to cover it all.
Okay, so there's a whole spectrum of ways that our past can kind of sneak up on us.
Absolutely. And it's not always obvious, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's these subtle things that we don't even realize are affecting us.
Okay, so before we dive into strategies,
okay,
I'd love to hear more about the different types of triggers.
Yeah, let's break it down.
Yeah, break it down.
So the book mentions sensory triggers, emotional triggers, and situational triggers. It's like a whole taxonomy.
A taxonomy, I like that.
Right.
So let's start with sensory triggers. What are those all about?
Okay, so sensory triggers, those are the ones that target our 5 senses. So think about a specific sound that just makes you cringe.
Like nails on a chalkboard.
Exactly. That's a sensory trigger.
Ugh, I can hear it now.
Right.
Or maybe it's a certain texture that makes you shudder.
Ooh, yeah, like velvet.
Velvet, yeah.
Some people just can't stand the feel of velvet.
I get that.
Yeah, so those are sensory triggers. Anything that really affects your senses in a negative way.
What about smells?
Oh, smells. Those are big ones.
Yeah, we talked about in part 1 how smells have a direct line to our emotional centers.
Right, to the limbic system,
right.
The emotional hub of our brains.
Which explains why, a whiff of your grandmother's perfume can instantly transport you back to her kitchen.
Exactly, even if she's been gone for years.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. Our senses are incredibly powerful at evoking memories and emotions.
Okay, that makes sense. So sensory triggers are all about those external cues that our senses pick up.
Right.
What about emotional triggers? Those seem a bit more internal.
Yeah, emotional triggers are less about the external world and more about our internal responses. It's those specific words or phrases or even concepts that just hit an emotional nerve.
So if someone says something that reminds you of a past hurt.
Exactly. Or maybe it's a certain tone of voice.
Okay.
That triggers a feeling of defensiveness or anger.
The book gives an example of someone who always feels anxious when they hear the phrase, "You can't do it."
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
It brings back memories of being criticized as a child.
Right, and it makes them doubt their abilities, even if they're perfectly capable.
So it's those phrases become shorthand for a whole emotional narrative.
Exactly. It's like a mental shortcut that our brains have created.
That's fascinating and a bit unsettling.
It can be.
So we got sensory triggers, emotional triggers. What about situational triggers? What are those all about?
Situational triggers are all about context.
Context.
Yeah, so it's the specific places, events, or social dynamics that recreate past experiences.
So if someone had a panic attack in a crowded elevator,
right,
they might feel anxious every time they step into an elevator afterward?
Exactly, even if they logically know that they're safe.
Right, because their brain is associating that situation with that past trauma.
Exactly. It's like our brains are constantly scanning our surroundings for potential threats.
And these situational cues are like alarm bells.
Right, warning us of possible danger.
Okay, so we've got sensory triggers, emotional triggers, and situational triggers. It's amazing how many ways our past can sneak up on us.
It really is, and it's different for everyone.
Right.
Some people are more sensitive to certain types of triggers than others.
Is there one type of trigger that tends to be more powerful than the others?
Well, it varies from person to person, but I would say triggers that are rooted in trauma often have the strongest hold on us.
Because trauma can really leave those deep imprints on our nervous systems.
Absolutely. It creates those intense, almost instinctive reactions that can feel impossible to control.
In part 1, we talked about how trauma can lead to those simplified explanations, those emotional reasoning patterns.
Right, like, I'm not good enough, or the world is a dangerous place.
Right. So how can we start to challenge those negative beliefs that stem from trauma?
That's where building resilience comes in.
Resilience.
And it often starts with recognizing those unhelpful thought patterns.
Okay.
And acknowledging that they might be rooted in a past experience that doesn't reflect the present reality.
So if someone constantly finds themselves thinking, I'm going to fail,
Right.
they might need to pause and ask themselves, is this thought based on evidence, or is it a leftover from a past experience where I felt inadequate?
Exactly. It's about becoming a detective of your own thoughts and feelings.
I like that, a thought detective.
Right, and gently challenging those thoughts that don't serve you.
Okay, so we're not trying to suppress those thoughts or pretend they're not there.
No, it's about acknowledging them and then choosing to focus on more helpful and realistic thoughts.
And that's where therapy can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Therapy can provide you with those tools and strategies to help you manage those thoughts and emotions more effectively.
The book mentions cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as a powerful tool for rewiring those thought patterns.
CBT is great.
Yeah.
It helps you to identify those negative thought patterns and then to challenge them and replace them with more positive and realistic ones.
So it's not about erasing the past or pretending that those traumatic experiences didn't happen.
Right.
It's about learning to reframe them in a way that doesn't hold you back.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the past, but not letting it define you.
That's powerful. And it's not just about therapy, right?
Yeah.
The book also emphasizes the importance of self-care and building resilience through everyday practices.
Absolutely. Things like getting enough sleep, exercising regularly, and practicing mindfulness can make a world of difference.
Because those activities help to regulate our nervous systems
Right.
and increase our capacity to cope with stress.
Which can then lessen the intensity of our reactions to triggers.
So it's like building up our emotional immune system.
I love that analogy.
Right. So we're better equipped to handle those emotional curveballs that life throws at us.
Exactly. And remember, building resilience is an ongoing process.
It's not a one-time fix.
No, it's a commitment to taking care of yourself, both physically and emotionally.
So we've talked about negative triggers and the impact of trauma, but I'm eager to shift gears and explore the positive side of this equation.
Okay, yeah, let's get positive.
We touched on positive triggers in part 1, those things that evoke joy, excitement, or a sense of peace.
Right.
Can we dive a bit deeper into how to cultivate those positive triggers intentionally?
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the negative, but focusing on the positive is just as important, if not more so.
Because our brains are wired to respond to positive stimuli just as strongly as they respond to negative ones.
Exactly.
Think about that feeling of excitement you get when you hear your favorite song.
Ooh, yeah.
Or the sense of calm that washes over you when you walk into a beautiful garden.
Those are positive triggers at work.
And just like we can unintentionally create negative triggers, we can also intentionally create positive ones.
Exactly. It's all about harnessing the power of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
The brain's ability to change and adapt based on our experiences.
So if we want to cultivate more joy and peace in our lives,
Yes.
we can actively seek out experiences that evoke those emotions.
Exactly. And we can create rituals and routines that act as triggers for those positive feelings.
Like that example from part 1 of saying I'm home, to signal a shift from work mode to relaxation mode.
Precisely. Or maybe it's listening to a specific playlist that always boosts your mood.
Okay.
Or lighting a scented candle that evokes feelings of tranquility.
By consciously creating these positive associations, we can start to rewire our brains to default to a more positive emotional state.
It's like training our brains to focus on the good rather than getting stuck in the negative.
That's so empowering. So instead of just trying to avoid the things that trigger us,
Yeah.
we can actively cultivate the things that make us feel good.
Exactly. It's about taking control of our emotional landscape and creating a more fulfilling and joyful experience of life.
This is where the conversation gets really exciting.
It does.
It reminds us that we're not just victims of our past experiences or our emotional wiring.
Right.
We have the power to choose how we respond, and we can actively shape our emotional well-being.
Absolutely. And that power extends beyond our personal lives.
Okay. Where else does it apply?
Well, in part 1, we briefly touched on how emotional triggers are used in marketing.
Right.
Let's unpack that a bit more. How do those marketing wizards tap into our emotional vulnerabilities to influence our decisions?
That's a great segue because we've covered a lot of ground on the individual level.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to explore how this understanding of emotional triggers plays out in the wider world.
It's all around us, from the ads we see to the news we consume.
Give me some examples.
Well, think about those limited time offers that create a sense of urgency and make us feel like we're going to miss out if we don't act now.
Oh yeah, FOMO.
Exactly, fear of missing out. That's a classic emotional trigger.
Or those celebrity endorsements that make us associate a product with someone we admire and trust.
Right, it's like if Oprah recommends it, it must be good. Those are all examples of marketers tapping into our emotional triggers to drive sales.
And it's not always a bad thing, right?
No, not at all. Emotional triggers can be used to create positive associations with brands and products.
Okay, so like those heartwarming commercials that make you feel all fuzzy inside.
Exactly. Or those ads that evoke a sense of nostalgia or belonging.
Those are all playing on our emotions.
They are, but in a way that can be quite effective.
But it's important to be aware of these tactics so we can make conscious choices as consumers.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we understand how these triggers work, the less susceptible we are to their influence.
So we've talked about personal triggers and marketing triggers.
Right.
Are there other areas where this understanding can be applied?
Oh, there are emotional triggers play a role in almost every aspect of human interaction, from our relationships to the way we navigate social media.
Okay, so it's not just about buying stuff.
No, it's about how we connect with each other and how we make sense of the world around us.
The book specifically mentions how understanding triggers can be helpful in relationships.
Oh, absolutely. It's like having a cheat sheet for navigating those emotionally charged moments.
Give an example.
Well, imagine being able to recognize your partner's emotional triggers and respond in a way that de-escalates the conflict rather than fueling it.
So instead of getting defensive or reactive,
Right. You're able to pause and to see the situation from their perspective.
that's emotional intelligence in action
It is, and it can make a huge difference in the quality of our relationships.
because it allows us to communicate more effectively.
Exactly, and to build stronger and more fulfilling connections.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the different types of triggers
We have
to the power of resilience and even the role of triggers in marketing and relationships.
It's all connected.
It's fascinating.
It is. It's about understanding the power of our emotions and how they shape our experiences.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We spent the last two parts really kind of spelunking into these emotional time travelers we call triggers.
Yeah, we've been deep
We have.
into like how they work, where they come from, and most importantly, how to kind of take control of them.
Right, because it's not about letting them control us.
Exactly.
So we really delved into like the personal side, exploring how understanding our own individual triggers can help us kind of navigate all the tricky situations.
Right, and build up that resilience so we don't get knocked down every time something triggers us.
Exactly. But now I'm kind of curious to like zoom out a little bit
Okay, yeah.
and look at how these triggers operate on a much larger scale.
The bigger picture.
Yeah, because it's not just a personal thing.
Right, it's societal too.
Right, like emotional triggers aren't just these personal quirks.
Right, they're everywhere.
They're woven into like the fabric of our culture,
Exactly.
influencing everything from, the news we consume to like the political landscape.
It's like this hidden language of emotions that's constantly shaping our perceptions and influencing our behavior.
Oh, that's a good way to put it, a hidden language.
Right, and we're not always aware of it.
So give me some examples of how this plays out in the real world.
Well, think about how certain images or phrases are used to evoke specific emotions in us, like a soaring patriotic anthem might trigger feelings of national pride.
Okay, yeah, I get that chills.
Right, or a grainy image of a crying child might spark feelings of empathy and a desire to help.
So it's like these emotional cues are being used to elicit certain responses from us.
Exactly, and it's not always a bad thing. I mean, emotional appeals can be incredibly powerful tools for driving positive change.
Right, like those campaigns that use those heart-wrenching images to raise awareness about animal cruelty.
Exactly, or those powerful speeches that inspire people to fight for social justice.
But as with many things, there's a flip side,
There is. It's a double-edged sword.
because those same emotional levers can be used to manipulate and exploit.
Absolutely. Think about the way news headlines are often crafted to evoke fear or outrage.
Clickbait.
Exactly. Clickbait driving clicks and engagement, even if the story itself is more nuanced or complex.
Or how political campaigns often rely on those emotional appeals, sometimes playing on our fears or prejudices to sway voters.
It's all about getting us riled up.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with emotional triggers from all directions.
Especially in this age of social media,
Oh, yeah.
where algorithms are literally designed to keep us scrolling by feeding us content that's designed to grab our attention.
And keep us engaged.
Exactly. It's the attention economy, and emotions are the currency.
So the more we understand how these triggers work, the less susceptible we are to their influence.
Absolutely. It's like learning to read the emotional subtext of the world around us.
Becoming more critical consumers of information.
Exactly. Less reactive to those attention-grabbing tactics.
So it's not just about being aware of those external triggers.
Right.
It's also about understanding our own vulnerabilities.
Yeah. Knowing yourself is key.
Right. Like what makes us tick? What pushes our buttons?
Exactly. What are those deep-seated beliefs or past experiences that shape our emotional responses?
So it goes back to that self-awareness that we talked about earlier.
It all comes back to that.
Yeah, the more we understand ourselves, the more equipped we are to navigate, the complexities of the world around us.
And the less likely we are to get swept away by those emotional currents.
Exactly. And once we know our own triggers,
Right.
we can start to build that resilience.
That's the goal.
Yeah, we can learn to pause before reacting to question our assumptions,
Right, to take a breath
to take a breath.
and choose a more conscious response.
Okay, so the book talks about creating positive triggers
Yes.
to counteract the negative ones.
It's like building an emotional arsenal of joy and resilience.
Oh, I love that. An emotional arsenal.
Right.
So remind us how that works.
Well, if we know that certain images or phrases make us feel anxious or stressed,
Okay.
we can intentionally surround ourselves with things that evoke feelings of peace and joy.
Okay, so like creating a playlist of uplifting songs,
Exactly.
filling our homes with like plants and natural light.
Yes.
Or even just making a conscious effort to focus on the good things in our lives.
It's all about shifting our focus.
So we're training our brains to see the world through like a more positive lens.
Exactly. And that can have a ripple effect, not just on our own well-being, but on the people around us as well.
Because when we're feeling grounded and centered,
Right.
we're less likely to react impulsively
Yeah.
or get swept up in like all the drama.
Right. And we're more likely to create positive change both in our own lives and in the world at large.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into emotional triggers,
It's been quite a journey.
it has. What's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I would say remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how emotional triggers work on both a personal and societal level, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of our emotional lives and create a more fulfilling and meaningful experience for ourselves and for others.
Beautifully said. This has been a fascinating exploration, and I hope it's inspired our listeners to start paying closer attention to their own emotional landscape and the forces that shape it for those who want to delve deeper. We highly recommend checking out the source material for this episode, Positive and Negative Mental Triggers. Learn how to master them. It's a treasure trove of insights and practical strategies. And remember, this is just the beginning of a lifelong journey of self-discovery and emotional mastery. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep choosing those responses that align with the life you want to create. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.